The Pacific, 1944. The air hung thick with the humidity of the jungle and the acrid scent of cordite. Beneath a relentless sun, the war machine churned, consuming lives and ideals. But amidst the chaos of combat, another, more subtle war was being waged, a war of hearts and minds, fought with unexpected weapons. It was a conflict not of bullets and bombs, but of biscuits and the stark realities they represented. The war in the Pacific was a brutal affair, characterized by fierce island-hopping campaigns and an almost fanatical resistance from Japanese forces. For years, the narrative spun by the Empire of Japan had painted a vivid picture of American decadence, of a nation soft and materialistic, incapable of true sacrifice. Propaganda posters depicted an enemy bloated by excess, a stark contrast to the lean, disciplined warrior spirit instilled in every Japanese citizen. This narrative was deeply ingrained, particularly within institutions like the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy hospitals, where nurses, trained in the austerity of wartime Japan, viewed their American adversaries with a mixture of contempt and bewilderment. They believed in the strength of their spirit, the resilience forged in hardship, and saw American prisoners of war, when they encountered them, as mere reflections of their nation's perceived weakness. The initial encounters were often fraught with this ingrained prejudice. Japanese nurses, dedicated to their duty and steeped in the cultural imperatives of their homeland, approached American POWs with a detached professionalism, tinged with a silent judgment. They observed the physical decline brought on by imprisonment, the haggard faces, the emaciated bodies, and saw it as confirmation of American softness. Their own rations were meager, reflecting the tightening grip of war on the Japanese home islands, yet they performed their duties with stoic resolve, believing their suffering was a noble contribution to the empire's glory. The idea of American luxury, even in captivity, was an alien concept, one that their training had taught them to scorn. Then came the biscuits. Not just any biscuits, but American Army rations. Hardtack, yes, but often accompanied by a small, unexpected luxury, a shortbread cookie, a piece of chocolate, or sometimes a sweet, sugary biscuit, designed to provide a small, morale-boosting comfort amidst the rigors of combat. These were items that, to the Japanese nurses, represented an almost scandalous indulgence. Their own soldiers, their own people, were subsisting on rice and miso, sometimes less. The idea that an enemy, even a captive one, would receive such comparatively rich fare was initially met with a disbelieving laugh, a nervous tittering that masked a deeper unease. It was a laugh born of propaganda, of the deeply held belief that such a nation of eaters could not possibly withstand the spiritual purity of Japan. Yet, hunger is a powerful equalizer. As the war progressed, and the supply lines to Japan's outer garrisons became increasingly tenuous, the reality of scarcity began to bite harder. The laughter faded, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. The nurses, often working long shifts with inadequate nourishment, found their own resolve tested not by enemy fire, but by the relentless ache in their stomachs. They saw the American biscuits, at first with disdain, then with a flicker of curiosity, and finally, with an undeniable longing. The smell, even if faintly sweet, was a stark contrast to the blandness of their own diet. It was a scent of a world they had been taught to despise, but one that held the undeniable promise of sustenance. The transformation began subtly. A discarded biscuit, left behind by a prisoner too ill to eat, might be cautiously picked up, examined, then, driven by desperation, tasted. The initial bite was often a revelation, a burst of flavor, a richness that their war-depleted palates had almost forgotten. This was not the thin gruel of their daily existence. This was food of substance, of a different, bewildering abundance. The whispers started, not about the enemy's perceived weakness, but about the strange, undeniable allure of their food. The carefully constructed edifice of propaganda began to show cracks, eroded by the simple, undeniable truth of a biscuit's taste. One such recurring symbolic object emerged from this strange exchange, the single, perfectly preserved chocolate bar from an American ration. It was an anomaly, a testament to a logistical capability and a standard of living that defied the wartime realities of almost every other nation. To the Japanese nurses, struggling to maintain their own caloric intake and witness the slow starvation of their patients, the chocolate bar became more than just a sweet treat. It was a tangible representation of American abundance, a stark, undeniable symbol of a prosperity they had been told was illusory, a nation they had been taught was struggling. Its smooth, dark surface, its rich, sweet taste, spoke volumes without a single word being uttered. It became a silent, potent counter-narrative to the tales of a decadent, weakening foe. The initial scorn gave way to quiet requests. At first, it was subtle, a hesitant gesture towards a prisoner's untouched plate. Then, as desperation mounted and the war's tide turned definitively against Japan, the requests became more direct, tinged with a fragile humility born of necessity. "Bisuketto, please," they might murmur, the Japanese word for biscuit, now imbued with a desperate significance. It was a profound shift. The same nurses who had laughed at the idea of American luxury now found themselves asking for it, driven by a primal need that transcended ideology. This simple act of asking, of accepting, represented a profound crack in the psychological armor of wartime indoctrination. It demonstrated a recognition, however grudging, of a different reality, a world where the enemy possessed not just military might, but also a capacity for a material existence beyond their own increasingly desperate imaginings. This transformation wasn't a sudden ideological conversion, but a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of deeply held beliefs, driven by the stark contrast between propaganda and palatable reality. The laughter had been an echo of a carefully crafted illusion, a defensive mechanism against a truth too inconvenient to acknowledge. The asking, however, was an admission of that truth. It was a moment where the human need for sustenance, for even a small comfort, began to chip away at the monolithic edifice of wartime hatred. The biscuits, initially a source of scorn, became a silent ambassador of a different kind of power, a power rooted in plenty. The taste of American sugar, flour, and butter, so alien to their own austere diets, began to rewrite the narrative of the enemy in the minds of those who encountered it. The war concluded, but the echoes of those simple biscuits lingered. For many Japanese nurses, the memory of that unexpected sweetness, the stark contrast it presented to their own privations, became a quiet, personal revelation. It was a testament to the immense disparity in resources, in industrial might, that characterized the conflict. It wasn't just about military victory. It was about the underlying strength of a nation that could provision its soldiers, even its prisoners, with such relative abundance. The chocolate bar, the sweet biscuit, they were more than mere food. They were fragments of a different world, a world of material comfort and industrial prowess that Japan, in its wartime asceticism, could not match. The experience of those biscuits and the quiet requests that followed marked a turning point for many, a subtle yet profound challenge to the rigid doctrines they had been taught. It underscored a fundamental truth about human nature, that despite ideological fervor, the tangible realities of sustenance and well-being hold an undeniable sway. The initial laughter, a brittle defense against an unimaginable reality, gave way to a deeper understanding, a quiet reevaluation of what they had been told. It was a powerful, if unspoken, testament to the truth of American abundance, a truth that permeated even the harsh confines of wartime captivity. The biscuits, once a symbol of perceived decadence, became a symbol of a different kind of strength, a strength that ultimately prevailed. This quiet, culinary encounter became a poignant footnote in the vast, brutal symphony of the Pacific War. It reminds us that beyond the grand narratives of battles and strategies, History is often shaped by smaller, more intimate moments, moments where deeply ingrained perceptions clash with undeniable realities. The simple act of offering and receiving, of laughing and then asking, speaks to the profound ways in which human needs can transcend political divides and ideological barriers. The sweet taste of a foreign biscuit, consumed in a moment of desperate hunger, offered not just physical nourishment, but a subtle, yet powerful, taste of a world beyond the confines of wartime propaganda. It revealed a deeper truth about the nature of humanity and the enduring power of something as simple as a shared morsel to bridge the chasm of conflict, even if for a fleeting, poignant moment. It was a silent testament to the eventual triumph of a different kind of strength, a strength built on the foundations of a flourishing society, a society capable of producing not just formidable weaponry, but also simple, comforting biscuits in abundance. In the grand theater of global conflict, where empires clashed and ideologies collided, the narrative spun by Imperial Japan was one of spiritual purity against material decadence. This was the bedrock upon which a nation rallied, a testament to the Bushido Code, the warrior's path, where self-sacrifice and an unwavering loyalty to the emperor were paramount. Propaganda films, newsreels, and radio broadcasts ceaselessly hammered home the message. Japan was a nation of disciplined, hardy warriors, spiritually superior to the soft, effeminate Western powers, particularly the United States. Americans were depicted as obese, pleasure-seeking individuals, more concerned with creature comforts than the stoic demands of warfare. Their industrial might, while formidable, was presented as a hollow strength, lacking the moral fiber that underpinned Japanese resolve. This manufactured image was absorbed deeply by the populace, from the rice paddies of the countryside to the bustling cities, and especially within the disciplined ranks of the imperial military and medical services. For the nurses serving in the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy hospitals, this worldview was not merely a belief. It was the very essence of their professional and personal identity. They were women of quiet strength, trained in an environment where personal comfort was secondary to duty and where suffering was often seen as a path to spiritual enlightenment. Their lives were defined by austerity, their meals sparse, their uniforms simple, their days long and arduous. They ministered to soldiers whose wounds were often horrific, yet who bore their pain with an almost superhuman endurance, often refusing anesthesia, believing that to fully experience their sacrifice for the emperor was a higher calling. In this crucible of self-denial and spiritual fortitude, the image of the American enemy as a gluttonous, comfort-loving foe served to solidify their own sense of moral superiority. They genuinely believed that a nation so consumed by material desires could never possess the inner strength required to defeat a people forged in the fires of sacrifice. The initial encounters with American prisoners of war only seemed to reinforce these deeply held prejudices. These were men, often emaciated and weakened by the privations of captivity, but whose very presence, to the Japanese nurses, represented the perceived fragility of their decadent nation. The nurses, observing their physical decline, often interpreted it not as a consequence of their own harsh prison conditions, but as an inherent weakness, a confirmation of the American inability to endure hardship. Their duty was to treat all patients, regardless of nationality, yet an unspoken contempt often lingered in their professional care. They themselves worked tirelessly, often on diets barely sufficient to sustain life, yet they did so with an unwavering sense of duty, convinced that their suffering contributed to the glorious destiny of Japan. The concept of luxury, particularly for a captive, was not just alien, it was morally offensive. Then, amidst the grim realities of war, the American rations began to appear. Not the staple rice and miso, but strange, exotic items, biscuits made with unheard-of quantities of sugar and butter, tinned meats and fruits, and, most remarkably, bars of chocolate. To the Japanese nurses, these provisions were a shocking anomaly. They represented a world of abundance, so profound it bordered on the surreal. Their own people, their own soldiers, were tightening their belts, sacrificing everything for the war effort. Yet, here were the enemy, even in captivity, with access to such lavish fare. The initial reaction was often a nervous, incredulous laugh, a ripple of disbelieving tittering that masked a deeper psychological unease. It was a laugh born of propaganda, of the deeply held belief that such a nation of eaters could not possibly withstand the spiritual purity of Japan. But hunger, as it often does, became a ruthless instructor. As the war raged on, and the carefully constructed supply lines of Imperial Japan began to buckle under the relentless pressure of Allied blockades, the reality of scarcity deepened. Remote garrisons and island outposts, once supplied by a steady stream of ships, found themselves increasingly isolated. Food became not just scarce, but dangerously so. The field hospitals, already stretched thin, saw their own rations dwindle to dangerously low levels. The nurses, once sustained by ideological fervor, now felt the gnawing ache of true hunger. Their stoic resolve was no match for the physiological demands of a body starved. The romanticized image of sacrifice began to fray around the edges, replaced by the grim, undeniable truth of physical privation. It was in this context of deepening desperation that the American provisions, initially scorned, began to exert an irresistible allure. The smell of the biscuits, even if faintly sweet and alien, was a potent contrast to the blandness of their own diet. The sight of a tinned peach, its syrup glistening, was an almost fantastical vision. The transformation of perception was subtle, insidious. A discarded biscuit, left behind by a prisoner too weak to eat, might be cautiously retrieved, examined with a mixture of suspicion and desperate curiosity. Then, driven by an instinct more powerful than propaganda, it would be tasted. The initial bite was often a revelation, a burst of flavor, a richness, a caloric density their war-depleted palates had almost forgotten. This was not the thin gruel of their daily existence. This was food of substance, of a bewildering, almost scandalous abundance. The whispers began, not of the enemy's moral failings, but of the strange, undeniable allure of their food. The carefully constructed edifice of propaganda began to show cracks, eroded by the simple, undeniable truth of a biscuit's taste. The chocolate bar, in particular, transcended mere sustenance to become a powerful, almost sacred symbol. During the war, cocoa and sugar were luxuries almost entirely absent from the Japanese diet, diverted for military use or simply unobtainable. The American chocolate bar, often robustly packaged and surprisingly resilient to the tropical humidity, was a marvel of industrial production. Its smooth, dark surface and rich, concentrated sweetness spoke volumes. For a nurse, holding such an item, smelling its potent aroma, was like holding a fragment of an alien world. It was a tangible representation of American abundance, a stark and undeniable symbol of a prosperity they had been taught was illusory, a nation they had been told was teetering on the brink of collapse. Its very existence contradicted the core tenets of their indoctrination. It became a silent, potent counter-narrative, a small but undeniable piece of evidence that chipped away at the manufactured image of a weak and decadent foe. This was not a nation struggling, but a nation that could afford such commonplace luxuries for its fighting men, even in the midst of a global war. Initially, the nurses maintained a facade of disdain. To openly acknowledge the desirability of enemy provisions would be to betray their patriotic duty, to concede a victory to the very propaganda they sought to debunk. But as hunger mounted and the physical toll of sustained deprivation began to wear down their resolve, the unspoken became articulate. Subtle gestures gave way to hesitant requests. A nurse might linger by a prisoner's cot, her eyes inadvertently drawn to an untouched portion of American rations. A faint clearing of the throat, a deferential bow, and then, almost a whisper. "Bisuketto, please?" The Japanese word for biscuit, now imbued with a desperate significance that transcended its simple meaning. It was a profound shift. The same nurses who had laughed at the idea of American luxury now found themselves asking for it, driven by a primal need that transcended ideology, duty, and indoctrination. This simple act of asking, of accepting, represented a profound crack in the psychological armor of wartime Japan. It demonstrated a recognition, however grudging, of a different reality, a world where the enemy possessed not just military might, but also a capacity for a material existence far beyond their own increasingly desperate imaginings. This transformation was not a sudden, dramatic ideological conversion, but a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of deeply held beliefs. The laughter, brittle and nervous, had been an echo of a carefully crafted illusion, a defensive mechanism against a truth too inconvenient to acknowledge. The asking, however, was an admission of that truth. It was a moment where the human need for sustenance, for even a small comfort, began to chip away at the monolithic edifice of wartime hatred. The biscuits, initially a source of scorn, became a silent ambassador of a different kind of power, a power rooted in economic might and abundant resources. The taste of American sugar, flour, and butter, so alien to their own austere diets, began to rewrite the narrative of the enemy in the minds of those who encountered it. It wasn't about moral superiority, it was about the tangible reality of a different kind of strength. The logistical genius of the American war machine was an unseen character in this unfolding drama. While Japanese supply lines stretched thin across vast ocean distances, vulnerable to submarine attacks and air interdiction, the United States, with its immense industrial capacity, was able to project power and provision its forces on an unprecedented scale. Every chocolate bar, every tin of biscuits, every packaged meal was a testament to a complex, resilient system of production, transportation, and distribution that simply had no equivalent in wartime Japan. The nurses, while perhaps not fully comprehending the intricate details of logistics, intuitively grasped the vast disparity. They witnessed the consistent, if sometimes meager, supply of American rations to even the most remote prisoner-of-war camps, a stark contrast to the increasing deprivation suffered by their own troops and civilians. This realization, born from the simple observation of daily rations, contributed significantly to the erosion of their initial belief in Japan's inherent material and spiritual superiority. These quiet, culinary encounters fostered a subtle shift in perception, not just towards the American enemy, but towards the very nature of conflict and national strength. The nurses, who had lived their lives under a strict regime of self-denial, began to question the efficacy of a system that prioritized spiritual fortitude over the tangible well-being of its people. The stark contrast between their own privations and the relative abundance of the enemy's provisions forced a re-evaluation of what constituted true national power. It became clear that industrial capacity, economic strength, and the ability to feed and care for one's population were not signs of decadence, but fundamental pillars of resilience and, ultimately, victory. This was a hard lesson, learned not from propaganda leaflets or military briefings, but from the simple, undeniable reality of a sweet biscuit. The war concluded, the bombs fell, and the dust settled over a broken Japan, forever altered by the cataclysm of defeat. But the echoes of those simple biscuits lingered in the minds of many. For the Japanese nurses, the memory of that unexpected sweetness, the stark contrast it presented to their own wartime privations, became a quiet, personal revelation that resonated long after the last shot was fired. It was a testament to the immense disparity in resources, in industrial might, that characterized the conflict, a disparity that was brought into sharp focus by something as mundane as food. It wasn't just about military victory. It was about the underlying strength of a nation that could provision its soldiers, even its prisoners, with such relative abundance. The chocolate bar, the sweet biscuit, they were more than mere food. They were fragments of a different world, a world of material comfort and industrial prowess that Japan, in its wartime asceticism, could not match. The decades that followed the war saw Japan rise from the ashes, transformed by new ideals and an embrace of economic pragmatism. For those who had experienced the war firsthand, particularly the nurses who had encountered the American biscuits, these small, sensory memories often served as a poignant touchstone. They represented a vivid, undeniable contrast between the old ways and the new, between a nation that glorified hardship and one that thrived on abundance. The chocolate bar, once a symbol of bewildering excess, gradually became a commonplace item in a revitalized Japan, a sweet reminder of a stark lesson learned. It illustrated not just the economic power of the victor, but also the universal human desire for comfort and satiety. These personal transformations, born of hunger and unexpected sweetness, contributed to a broader societal shift, a reevaluation of national priorities and values. The experience of bisuketto became a quiet, enduring narrative within the larger story of Japan's post-war reconstruction and its eventual integration into a globalized world where abundance, rather than austerity, became the aspirational norm. It underscored the profound and often overlooked truth that even in the most brutal of conflicts, the simple act of sustenance can carry a message far more potent and transformative than any weapon. The memory of nurses, initially laughing, then asking, then quietly accepting, encapsulates a profound human journey, from indoctrinated prejudice to a grudging recognition of shared humanity and, ultimately, to an embrace of a world where the sweetness of a biscuit could symbolize a future built on prosperity and peace. It is a powerful reminder that while grand narratives of history are often etched in blood and fire, the subtle currents of human experience, like the quiet consumption of a chocolate bar, can carve equally deep and lasting impressions on the soul of a nation. The epilogue of such an experience reverberates through the decades, a subtle yet persistent refrain in the grand symphony of history. It is a reflection on the profound human truth that beneath the banners of ideology and the fury of conflict, there lies a shared vulnerability, a common need for sustenance and comfort. The laughter, initially a weapon of propaganda, transformed into a plea for basic needs, ultimately evolving into a quiet understanding. The biscuits, and especially the resilient chocolate bar, became more than just food. They were a testament to the power of a system that championed individual prosperity, fostering an environment where innovation and abundance flourished. In the quiet aftermath of war, these small encounters became seeds of a new perception, helping to cultivate a deeper appreciation for the complex interplay between freedom, economic vitality, and human dignity. They offered a poignant reminder that while conflicts may be waged with steel and fire, the enduring truths about a nation's strength are often revealed in the simplest of provisions: a humble biscuit, a sweet chocolate, generously supplied even to those considered enemies. This narrative, woven from the threads of hunger and unexpected kindness, speaks to the ultimate triumph of humanity's shared needs over the divisive forces of war and ideology, fostering, in its wake, a quiet reverence for the enduring promise of abundance and the profound dignity it bestows. The gnawing emptiness was not merely physical, it was existential. The Japanese nurses, trained to view their bodies as instruments of service, subject to the iron will of the empire, found themselves confronted by a rebellion of the flesh. Their own hunger pangs, persistent and undeniable, forced a recognition of their shared vulnerability with the very prisoners they treated. This shared physical reality began to break down the walls of otherness. The American POWs, initially perceived as weak and spoiled, revealed a resilience born not of spiritual dogma, but of sheer biological drive and a pragmatic will to survive. Their occasional complaints, though initially met with disdain, gradually began to seem less like weakness and more like a human response to inhumane conditions, a response the nurses, in their deepest moments of exhaustion and hunger, found themselves secretly echoing. Consider the subtle shift in their medical approach. Initially, the strict adherence to protocol, even in cases of extreme deprivation, would have been paramount. But as the gap between their resources and the enemy's became stark, a new, pragmatic form of empathy emerged. When a critically ill American POW would refuse their meager, unfamiliar Japanese sustenance, a nurse, perhaps remembering the aroma of a discarded American ration, might discreetly, and against regulations, encourage him to eat a piece of captured biscuit, even if it meant a slight deviation from the prescribed diet. These small acts of defiance against doctrine, born of a genuine desire to preserve life, became increasingly common. The ethical imperative to heal transcended the ideological imperative to despise. The visual contrast was equally potent. The stark, minimalist aesthetic of Japanese military life, embodying a rejection of superfluous material goods, stood in direct opposition to the practical, yet often brightly packaged, American rations. A vivid red and white tin of condensed milk, for instance, spoke not just of its contents, but of a culture that didn't shy away from color, from branding, from a certain cheerfulness in its packaging, a stark difference from the somber, utilitarian designs prevalent in wartime Japan. The visual impact alone was a small cultural shock, hinting at a world where even basic necessities were presented with an eye towards psychological uplift, a detail entirely absent in their own austere environment. This broader understanding of strength extended beyond mere industrial output. The American capacity for research and development, for rapid innovation in food science, meant their rations were not merely abundant but also nutritionally optimized, designed for caloric efficiency and shelf stability in extreme conditions. While Japanese dietitians struggled with substitutes and diminishing returns, American scientists engineered a biscuit that was both palatable and sustaining. This technological prowess, albeit observed indirectly through the products themselves, became another facet of American power that the nurses, in their quiet observations, could not ignore. It was a form of strength that spiritual resolve alone could not overcome, a testament to a societal commitment to practical problem-solving and scientific advancement. The end of the war did not merely conclude hostilities, it opened a vast chasm in the Japanese psyche. The initial period of defeat was marked by profound despair and a questioning of everything they had been taught. For many, the personal memories of American provisions and the subtle ways those provisions had eroded their wartime propaganda became crucial anchors in navigating this new, uncertain reality. The chocolate bar, once a contentious symbol, began its slow transformation into an emblem of hope and possibility. Its availability, initially through the American occupation forces and later through burgeoning trade, represented a tangible link to the outside world, a world of material promise that contrasted sharply with their recent past. This was not simply an adoption of Western consumerism, but a deeper, more nuanced learning. The nurses, now civilians in a shattered nation, carried with them a profound understanding of what true resilience entailed, not just the capacity for endurance, but the ability to innovate, to produce, and to nurture. They saw how a nation could be both materially prosperous and deeply moral, capable of immense power, yet also of individual acts of kindness. This personal transformation, replicated across millions of Japanese citizens, slowly began to reshape the collective consciousness. The emphasis on austerity gave way to a drive for economic growth, on isolation to international engagement. The lessons from the war, etched in the memory of taste and sight, were quietly integrated into the national rebuilding effort. The echoes of bisuketto, therefore, reverberate as a powerful, understated narrative within the grand tapestry of Japan's post-war miracle. It highlights the profound truth that victory in a total war is not solely determined by military might, but by the comprehensive strength of a nation's entire system, its economy, its technology, its logistical prowess, and, crucially, its capacity to care for its people. The initial laughter of the Japanese nurses, a reflex of denial against an uncomfortable truth, morphed into a quiet, almost reverent request, and eventually into a shared understanding that transcended the animosity of war. This subtle, almost invisible human exchange, fueled by the simplest of foods, ultimately contributed to a new era of dialogue, mutual respect, and an economic interdependence that would have been unimaginable just years before. It underscores a timeless message that even in the most brutal conflicts, the human spirit, driven by fundamental needs, finds ways to connect, to learn, and to ultimately forge a path towards a future where shared abundance can, perhaps, eclipse the bitter memories of past privation. It is a testament to the quiet, profound power of a humble biscuit to rewrite history, one bite at a time.